Hi everyone. We are now at chapter 4. This is our last chapter in unit 2 where we are studying cells and tissues. So chapter 4 is now building on what we learned back in chapter 3. In chapter 3 we learned about the cells, so now just building upward, that's where we are now in the tissue chapter. So let's get to our not really attendance question. Two very brief ones today. What is the smallest unit of life? And what is a group of cells with similar function working together called? These should be relatively easy, I hope, but go ahead and try to answer these before moving on. And let's take a look to see what the correct answer for these is. What is the smallest unit of life? That would be the cell. There are things smaller than cells, organelles all the way down to atoms, and really even smaller than that. But cells are where life first appears. Anything smaller than a cell is not alive, but cells are alive. What is a group of cells with similar function working together called? Tissues. And that's going to be the focus of today's lecture, which is going to be a relatively brief lecture because much of this was already covered in lab, so we will skip over some of it in lecture since you've already been exposed to it. So an overview of tissues, like we just said, a tissue is a group of cells often with a similar shape. They have similar function, they're working together. And the study of tissues is called histology. Now, histology really is the study of tissues and cells, but more often you will just hear it called the study of tissues. And there are a lot of different tissue types in the body, but they are classified into 4 basic tissue types. And those 4 basic tissue types are epithelial tissues, connective tissues, muscle tissues, and nervous tissue. And we will look at the different types of each of those today. Now in lab, we already looked at the epithelial tissues and some of the connective tissues, and we will look at the remaining connective tissues in a lab that's just around the corner. But let's begin with just a brief bit of coverage of epithelial tissues. And when we talk about epithelial tissues, really there's 2 categories or 2 forms of epithelial tissue. There is covering epithelial tissue, which is really what we looked at in lab, and there is glandular epithelial tissue. So the glands of our bodies are epithelial also. But really what we're going to be talking about right now with the epithelial tissues are the covering epithelial tissues. And these are tissues that either cover body surfaces or line body cavities. So this could be the skin is an obvious body surface, but we could also mean like the outside surface of the stomach, the outside surface of the intestines, something like that, or lining hollow body areas like the inside of the lungs, the inside of the stomach, the inside of our blood vessels. So places where it's hollow. And when we talk about covering epithelial tissues, we say that they have polarity. And there's that word again, polarity. Remember what that means from chapter 2 and chapter 3. Polarity means that one part of something has different properties than another part of something. And epithelial tissues fit this exactly. When we look at covering epithelial tissues, there's going to be one side that is exposed, and there's going to be one side that is attached to something beneath it. So to use some more proper anatomical terms, there's going to be the deep surface, which is the basal surface. It's attached to things deep to it. And there's going to be things that are sides that are superficial, exposed either to the environment or that does not have anything sitting on it. So the apical surface, think apex, the apical surface is exposed. The basal surface is what is attached to whatever is deep to it. And these two sides have different properties. It is very common for the apical surface of many epithelial tissues to have either microvilli or cilia. Microvilli, remember those increased surface area. We find this commonly in the digestive tract, inside the intestines. The apical surface have microvilli so that we could either secrete digestive enzymes or absorb nutrients. Cilia, commonly found inside the trachea. Remember, cilia move things along. This is what moves the mucus up so that we could cough things out. Now on the basal surface, we keep saying that it's attached to something deep to it. Now, this side has something called the basal lamina. The basal lamina. And this is kind of carbohydrates and other protein fibers that are secreted by the basal surface to help it grip whatever is deep to it. And we'll come back to that on the next slide in just a moment. But for right now, just know the basal surface secretes the basal lamina to grip whatever is deep to it. It is also extremely common to see special contacts between the cells of covering epithelial tissues, specifically tight junctions and desmosomes that we saw back in chapter 3. These cells, since they are kind of forming a barrier, we want them to hold on to each other tightly. And when we see covering epithelial tissues, I say that it's sitting on something. Well, that something that it's sitting on is going to be some form of connective tissue, most commonly areolar connective tissue. Now, areolar connective tissue, or whatever other tissue we have that is a connective tissue deep to the epithelial tissue, is going to secrete something called a reticular lamina more superficially. We could think of it as upward, but it's not always up. So we'll say superficially. This connective tissue secretes a reticular lamina, which is also things like carbohydrates and protein fibers. And the reticular lamina is going to give the basal lamina something to hold on to. The epithelial tissue secretes basal lamina deep. The connective tissue secretes reticular lamina superficially, and then the reticular lamina and the basal lamina grip onto each other. Think of it as the two sides of Velcro. They grip each other. And together, the basal lamina from the epithelial tissue and the reticular lamina from the connective tissue make something called the basement membrane. The basement membrane. This one, it holds the epithelial tissue in place, but two, it also forms a barrier. This helps to keep things from penetrating through that epithelial layer. But what kind of things can penetrate? Well, sometimes cancer. Epithelial tissue is pretty prone to cancer because every time that a cell divides, it is at risk for having errors that are not caught. Some of those errors can lead to cancer that we learned about back in chapter 3. So, the more often that a cell divides, the more likely it is to develop one of these errors that can cause it to become cancerous. Since epithelial tissues are exposed to environments, either the external environment or lining the digestive cavity, things like that, they are exposed, that means they're constantly being brushed away. And if we're brushing old cells away, we have to replace them. So epithelial tissues are highly mitotic. What does that mean? It means they're going through mitosis, cell division, a lot. The more they go through cell division, the more prone something is to becoming cancerous. So epithelial tissues are prone to cancer. Now, if you hear something called a metastatic cancer, if a cancer has metastasized, that means that it has broken off from where it was and migrated to some other point in the body. Sometimes you may hear something like someone has bladder cancer that has metastasized to the lungs. That does not mean they had bladder cancer and now they have lung cancer. It is still bladder cancer, and it is pieces of bladder that have migrated and are now growing in the lungs. When a cancer metastasizes, it is just pieces of it break off. It stays the same thing, but now it's growing somewhere else. Well, if a cancer metastasizes, that means that it has developed the ability to cross that basement membrane. Epithelial tissues are avascular. A in front of a word usually means not. So avascular means it does not have blood vessels. The blood vessels are near, but they do not extend into covering epithelial tissue. They are innervated. That means they do have nerves. So they don't have blood vessels, but they do have nerves. And as a general rule, epithelial tissues are highly regenerative. That means if there's damage to them, they can replace themselves. And as we saw in lab, we can classify epithelial tissues using usually two words. The first word, simple or stratified, tells us how many layers there are. Simple is a single layer. Stratified is more than a single layer. And the second word tends to be something to do with the shape. Squamous, squashed, flat. Cuboidal, roughly cube-shaped, or about the same height and width. Sometimes they're more circular. And columnar, tall and thin. So you'll see something like simple squamous or stratified squamous, simple columnar, something like that. One that stood out was pseudostratified columnar. Pseudo means fake. So this is columnar epithelium that looks like it is stratified, but it's faking it. It's only simple. It only has a single layer, but when we look at it, it looks like it has more than one layer. So since we looked at all of our epithelial tissues that we're responsible for in lab, I am not going to go over those tissues. But I will talk a little bit about glandular epithelium. Glands are parts of our body that produce secretions. And they could be any number of secretions. They could be something like mucus. They could be something like a hormone. So they just produce secretions. And those secretions, we could have endocrine glands or exocrine glands. Endocrine glands release their secretions into the bloodstream. Exocrine glands release their secretions either onto the body's surface or into a hollow body cavity. For example, sweat glands are exocrine. Glands lining our digestive tract to help break our food down are exocrine. They are releasing substances either onto our body's surface, in the case of sweat glands, or into a hollow body opening, in the case of those digestive glands. There are unicellular glands. We saw some of those in lab, and we see them over here on the right side of the screen. These are goblet cells. Goblet cells are glands, but they're only a single cell. Or they could be multicellular. And our book goes into a lot of detail with these multicellular glands, talking about all the different shapes and branching patterns. Don't worry about that. You do not need to know that for our class. I will not ask you anything about them on an exam. So just know unicellular or multicellular. And we divide these glands based on their mode of secretion. We hear merocrine glands or holocrine glands. All this is asking, how is the secretion released? In the case of a merocrine gland, it is through exocytosis. We produce things packed in vesicles, like we saw back in chapter 3. Those vesicles travel to the edge of the cell, and then exocytosis. They are released from the cell. But holocrine glands do something different. Holocrine glands keep making more and more and more of their product until that cell gets completely full, and then it bursts open, releasing its secretion. Or it lyses. Remember, lysis is when something breaks open. Well, in this case, it's the whole cell that breaks open. Because it is so full of its secretion, the cell pops like an overfull water balloon, releasing whatever it was that it was making. Okay, so moving away from epithelial tissues, and again, you do need to know those epithelial tissues we learned in lab. I'm just not going to take up lecture time to go through those. Now we're going to look at connective tissues. Connective tissues are really, really different from each other. If we look at different epithelial tissues, they all look pretty similar. But if we look at connective tissues, they all look very, very different, but they do have some common characteristics. Where did they come from? Connective tissue tends to come from something called the mesoderm. That's an embryonic layer of tissue. They all came from the mesoderm. But they have varying degrees of vascularity. Some of them are avascular, just like we saw with the epithelial tissue. For example, cartilage is avascular. Some of them are vascularized. So it's just a matter of which tissue we're looking at. Bone is vascularized. One thing that they all have in common is they have a very extensive extracellular matrix. Remember, the area outside of cells. When we looked at epithelial tissues in lab, the cells were packed very, very tightly together. Almost everything you saw was cellular, and there wasn't a lot of extracellular matrix. Connective tissue is just the opposite. Almost everything you see is extracellular matrix, and there are some cells scattered here and there throughout, and for the most part, they're not really touching each other. Now, if we look at that extracellular matrix, there's a couple of things that we will find there. We will see something called ground substance, which is non-fibrous. It's kind of this thick jelly-like stuff. It has a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of amino acids, and then we will see fibers. And depending on which connective tissue we're looking at, we'll see different fibers. The most common is collagen. Collagen. This is actually the most common protein in the body. This is what gives our skin its toughness. So collagen fibers, they're very thick. Elastic fibers, very, very thin, very, very stretchy. And reticular fibers, which form an even thinner framework. This is what we find in things like our lymph nodes. Now, you won't see all three of these in every single fiber. You'll see one or two, some of them you may see all three, but as a general rule, you will see some of these. And you will see lots of different cell types. You will see things like fibroblast. Now here's a good time to talk about root words. When you see B-L-A-S-T at the end of a word, blast, that means birth or give rise to or build. What is it that they're building? Whatever comes in front of it. So fibers, fibroblasts are the cells that build the fibers that are in that tissue. Chondroblast, we don't see any in this image, but chondra means cartilage. Chondroblasts are the cells in cartilage that give rise to other cartilage cells. Osteoblast, osteo means bone. Osteoblasts are bone stem cells that give rise to other bone cells. Here we see something, it says fat cell, but it's better to call it an adipocyte. Cyte just means cell, and adipose is fat. So an adipocyte is a fat cell. And leukocytes. Leukocytes are white blood cells. For example, macrophages or monocytes, lymphocytes, neutrophils. Things like those are white blood cells. They're part of our immune system. Macrophage, it begins as a type of white blood cell called a monocyte. But once it leaves our bloodstream and it moves out into the tissues like this, it crawls through kind of like an amoeba. We call it a macrophage. Remember what phage means, or phage, to eat. This is a big, macro is big, phage, eat. So this is a big cell that eats things. Mast cells, those arise from our immune cells. They are kind of like the neighborhood watch. When they spot something that should not be there, they release chemicals. One of them is called histamine. One of them is called heparin. But these cause things like inflammation and swelling, but it's an immune response to let your immune system know, hey, there's something here that doesn't belong here. Now we're going to skip over the connective tissues because we looked at them a lot in lab, and we will be looking at more of them in a lab that's coming up. So we're not going to spend time in lecturing those. But our next two tissue classes, muscle and nerve, we are going to look at those specific tissues in a little more depth. So let's start with muscle. Muscle tissue, there's different types, but it has some common characteristics. It is highly cellular. There are lots of cells. There's very little, if any, extracellular matrix. It is very well vascularized. It uses a lot of ATP, so it needs a lot of oxygen and nutrients. So we have to have a good blood supply. It's made of, or it contains proteins called myofilaments. These are what allow it to contract. And it can be either voluntary or involuntary. Voluntary means we intentionally cause it to contract and relax. Or involuntary means it happens without us thinking about it. For example, in our heart. So there's going to be three types of muscle tissue. The first one we're going to look at is called skeletal muscle. And skeletal muscle is the muscle that we generally are thinking about when we think about muscle. These are the muscles that we find in our limbs, in our trunk, down our back, in our neck and face. So the muscle that we think about moving when we raise our hand, when we're walking down the hallway, when we're writing to take notes or chewing food. Those are all intentional movements. So skeletal muscle is voluntary. Now, when we look at skeletal muscle under a microscope, it's going to be organized in these long cylinder shape cells with lots of nuclei. Back when we were first learning cells, we said the majority of cells in our body are mononucleated, or they just have one nucleus. Well, skeletal muscle is the big exception. Skeletal muscle is multinucleated. It has lots of nuclei. And you don't really need to know this, but an interesting kind of side note, the reason that they have lots of nuclei is because during development, they start out as a lot of individual cells with one nucleus, but all of those cells merge together and their nucleus stays there, so we end up with one big cell with a lot of nuclei. When we look at them under a microscope, which we see over here, we have these stripes. These are called striations. So long cylindrical cells with lots of nuclei and striations. We find these, like I said, attached to bones, sometimes attached to skin. And these are intentional, voluntary movements. Next, cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. It's very similar to skeletal muscle in that it is striated. It's these long fibers, except they branch. If we go back and look at skeletal muscle, they are really, really long, but they do not branch. When we look at any muscle in the body, whether it be a very short muscle like in our hands, or a very long muscle like in our arms or legs, the length of the muscle is the same as the length of the muscle cells. One muscle cell runs from one end of the muscle to the other. But in cardiac muscle, the cells are shorter. They're still kind of cylindrical, but they're shorter, and they branch. So they're not true cylinders. They are branched, and they branch and join end to end with neighboring cells. When they do that, what we end up seeing are these regular striations we see here on the drawing and here on the actual cardiomyocytes or cardiac muscle cells. But where they meet, there's a darker, thicker striation. We see those right here. These are where cardiac muscle cells join end to end. These are called intercalated discs. Intercalated discs. And intercalated discs, while this is where they join end to end, think back to chapter 3 when we were talking about the different types of cell junctions. We said cardiac muscle cells have desmosomes and gap junctions. Both of those are found here at the intercalated discs. And like we said, it's only found in the heart, and it is involuntary. We do not have to think for our heart to beat. And as a matter of fact, if we took the heart out of the body and supplied it with all the nutrients that it needed, it would still continue to beat on its own. It is involuntary. It does not require us to think about it. Lastly, smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is the third type of muscle. It is very weird compared to the other two as far as shape goes. It is very short. We say it is spindle-shaped or oval-shaped. It has one single nucleus per cell, just like most cells in our body. It does not have striations like the other two muscle cell types. The cells are packed pretty closely together. They do not join end to end. Their function, well, they are involuntary. We don't have to think about them to move. They either move substances through body parts, like our digestive tract. This is what moves food through our digestive tract. This is what pushes a baby out of the body. This is what causes us to either hold urine in or release urine. Also, this dictates the size or the diameter of our blood vessels. We find these around hollow organ walls. So, for example, here we see the intestines. The intestines have a ring of smooth muscle and a long sheet of smooth muscle. There's 2 layers in most of the digestive tract of smooth muscle. Now, changing gears, looking at nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is both a class and a type. So there are not different types of nervous tissue. There is just nervous tissue. Nervous tissue are electrically conductive tissues that allow one part of our body to communicate with another part of our body. When we look at it under a microscope, we see a few different things. We see these really big, obvious cells with long threads coming out of them. Those are called neurons. Usually when we say nerve cells, these are what we're talking about. Neurons, these are what conduct electricity. But really, even though it's not as obvious, there's a lot more of the other types of nerve cells called glial cells. And that's what all of these things in the background are. We have a few of these big neurons, but we have lots of other things in the background called glial cells. And glial cells, it's not actually a cell. It is lots of different types of cells, all with different functions. So sometimes we will just see them called supporting nerve cells. We will be looking in depth at nervous tissue a little later after we get through Unit 3 and start Unit 4. So the function to transmit electrical signals from either sensory receptors to effectors or back from sensory receptors to the brain or spine. We find these in the brain, the spinal cord, spinal nerves, and cranial nerves. So those are all the tissue types. But let's go and look a little bit more at body membranes. Body membranes are kind of a combination of epithelial tissue and connective tissue. And there's 3 types of body membranes. The first one, the cutaneous membrane, which really is the skin, is a dry membrane that covers almost the entire body surface. Next, mucous membranes line the body cavities. So things like the inside of the nose, the inside of the mouth, the inside of the digestive tract, the inside of the lungs. And finally, serous membranes, which we talked about back in Chapter 1. Serous membranes line body cavities that are not exposed to the environment. So between the body cavity wall and the organs themselves. Both mucous membranes and serous membranes are wet, and we said the cutaneous membrane is dry. Now we'll talk about how tissue gets repaired. And most tissues in the body can repair themselves to some degree or another. But when they regenerate themselves, it will follow two different pathways. There's something called regeneration or fibrosis. So let's first look at the steps of how tissue kind of heals itself or repairs itself, and then we'll talk about the difference in regeneration and fibrosis. So here we see just kind of a cut has formed, we've stopped bleeding, we've already got a blood clot and a scab is forming, but inflammation is going to happen. Now usually we think of inflammation as a bad thing because it's painful, it's red, it's swollen, but really inflammation is an immune response. It is our body doing what it's supposed to do. So when we get this blood clot and scab in place, the blood vessels in the area, the small blood vessels, they become very permeable, meaning leaky. And when they do that, white blood cells, part of our immune system, fluids, things like plasma serum, clotting proteins, and other plasma proteins are going to leak out and start to cause this area to swell a little bit. We're filling this tissue with stuff coming out of the blood. The blood itself clots, the surface dries, it forms a scab. Meanwhile, this tissue is continuing to fill up. Organization is step 2. So the clot itself starts to be replaced by something called granulation tissue. This is tissue that's going to start to rebuild any damaged blood vessels. Fibroblasts, remember the cells that produce fibers, they're going to start producing collagen fibers. That's going to start to kind of stitch up where the damage was. Macrophages, remember the big cells that eat things, are going to phagocytize both our own dead cells and cells that are dying, other debris that's in the area, any bacteria that may have gotten in. And surface epithelial tissue is going to start to go through mitosis very rapidly. It's going to spread across that granulation tissue. It's going to start replacing anything that's there that is not epithelial tissue, trying to fill it back in with what we started with. And finally, the very last step, regeneration and fibrosis. So the difference in the two is regeneration. You are replacing damaged tissue with the same tissue. Fibrosis is you are replacing damaged tissue with more fibers than it had to begin with. When a tissue regenerates, when it is repairing itself, it is not straight regeneration, it is not straight fibrosis, it is a combination of both. But depending on the type of tissue, maybe you get more regeneration, or maybe you get more fibrosis. The difference is when the tissue has finished repairing itself, what does it look like? What does it feel like? When you have a scar, that means there was a lot more fibrosis, not so much regeneration. When you have something like a paper cut and there's not really a scar there, that was a lot more regeneration and not very much fibrosis. And different tissues will have different levels of regenerative ability. Things like epithelial tissue, bone tissue, areolar, dense irregular, hematopoietic, which is blood-forming tissue. These are all highly regenerative. They can replace themselves very easily. Moderate, we have smooth muscle and dense regular. Pretty weakly regenerative is skeletal muscle and cartilage. If you've ever torn a knee cartilage, you know that it is really, really tough to get that back where it needs to be. And practically none is cardiac muscle and nervous tissue. If we hurt the heart and it needs to repair itself, it's not going to regenerate very much at all. If we damage the spinal cord or the brain, depending on the type of damage, it's not really going to repair itself very much. We'll see that a little bit differently when we get to learning about the nervous system. There's some catch there, but as a general rule, nervous tissue is not really regenerative. Let's look at a couple of thinking cap questions. First, why do scars feel different from the surrounding skin? And why is scar tissue on the heart such a problem? So think about those. Treat these as test questions. See if you can figure those out. Don't just go straight to listening to the response. Go ahead and pause your video and try to answer those. Okay, so let's see, why do scar tissues feel different from the surrounding skin? Well, because there's a lot more fibrosis. There's a lot more of those collagen fibers. So it's going to be different than just straight epithelial tissue. Next, why is scar tissue on the heart such a problem? Well, if you damage the heart, if you have a heart attack, then that part of the heart has died. Those cardiac muscle cells have died. And since the heart is so weakly regenerative, it's going to replace itself with scar tissue. Why is that an issue? Because think scar tissue, what can it do or what can't it do versus cardiac muscle? What does cardiac muscle do? It contracts and relaxes, contracts and relaxes. But scar tissue can't do that. So anytime we damage the heart with something like a heart attack, even after it has repaired itself as much as it can, it's not going to behave like a fully functioning heart. It's not going to be able to contract and relax the way that the heart needs to do. All right, that brings us to the end of lecture for chapter 4. That also brings us to the end of unit 2. We will be having our second lecture exam here very shortly. It's right around the corner. And then once we get through that, we will dive into actual systems biology when we begin unit 3. Studying the skin will be our first body system, the integumentary system. All right, if you have any questions, reach out, speak to me, speak to a tutor, but make sure to study, because this is the exam that has chapter 24 on it. This is the exam that covers cellular respiration and metabolism, and students I know struggle with that. So make sure you're asking questions about that as you study also. All right, I will see you in the next lecture, and hopefully you do very, very well on the exam. Take care. See you next time.